Good morning, everyone, and welcome into this webinar. I would like to first, on behalf of Wits School of Governance and Wits Business School, welcome you. And we are in a situation today where we're reflecting on the speech by our Minister of Finance. We all know that it generates a lot of debate, discussions. Yesterday, I was watching on TV. Everyone's got a view on this. Some is very informed views, but some don't really be careful what I need to say, but don't have informed views on this matter. So we're very happy that as a School of Governance and Wits Business School, and I'd also like to acknowledge Professor Mzugisi Kobo, who heads the Wits School of Governance, for the cooperation of the two schools to bring this initiative. We've got a panelist team here that is esteemed panelist that knows a lot about this subject. And I'm not going to lead that. I'm just opening and welcoming you. I'm going to hand over to Odile to take over from now. Thank you very much, and we appreciate your presence.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Prof. Khadebe, for the introduction. Today we will be unpacking the budget, which was presented by Minister Tito Mboweni yesterday afternoon. To help us do so, we have a panel of distinguished guests who have experience in various aspects related to the finances of our country. On our panel, we have Professor Nhlanhla Nene. Professor Nene is a non-executive director and chairman of Arise BV, a Dutch-based investment company investing in Africa. He is also a non-executive director and chairman of Impact Group, formerly known as Compass Group South Africa, a non-executive director of Growbank Limited, a non-executive director of Tebe Investment Corporation, and a non-executive director of the Council for Health Services Accreditation in Southern Africa. Professor Nene is a former Minister of Finance, which I'm sure we all know, and a member of the South African Parliament, or a former member who holds various certificates and degrees in economics. Then we have Busi Sibeko, who will be joining us shortly. Busi is an economist and researcher at the Institute for Economic Justice. She holds a Bachelor of Sciences in Economics from Duke University and a Master's in Political Economy of Development from SOAS at the University of London. Busi's current research focus is macroeconomic policy, including tax justice, fiscal and monetary policy, and participatory feminist budgeting to advance socioeconomic rights. She sits on the steering committee of the Budget Justice Coalition, which is comprised of various civil society organizations. She has been engaged in budget advocacy work in various capacities, from training other activists to media engagements. She also provides research support to the Labour constituency, and she has authored the austerity cost lessons for South Africa and is a co-author of a fiscal stimulus for South Africa. In 2020, Busi was featured in the Roundtable series of renowned economists on rethinking the global economy to deliver sustainable development by the United Nations Secretary General. We also have Ulebogeng Ramatlhodi. Ulebogeng is a director at Deloitte with over 10 years extensive global trade advisory consulting experience. His experience extends to being the executive responsible for implementation of information technology solutions, which includes automation and streamlining of customs registration processes, trade facilitation, as well as curbing illicit trade in the public sector. He is also a member of the South African Institute of Tax Professionals and serves on its Customs Steering Committee. Lastly, we have Dr. Kenneth Creamer, who is an economist based at the University of the Witwatersrand. He has master's degrees in law and financial economics and a PhD from Wits. In addition to his senior lecturer position, Creamer is a member of Cyril Ramaphosa's Presidential Economic Advisory Committee. He is also a member of the Management Committee of the South African Student Solidarity Foundation for Education, which raises funds for tertiary education students in need of support, and serves in the management of Creamer Media, publisher of engineering news, Mining Weekly, and Polity. Okay, so those are our panelists. Each of them will have 15 minutes to give us an overview of their thoughts on the budget which was presented. They will share with us what they thought was good and where there is room for improvement. We will then open the floor for discussion, and I will encourage the audience to drop any questions that they may have for the panelists in the Q&A. If you are streaming live from Facebook, you are also welcome to post your comments, and I will post those to the panelists. Okay, so without further ado, I am going to give Nhlanhla an opportunity to do his presentation. He will then be followed by Olebogeng and Busi, and we'll give Kenneth an opportunity last. Okay, over to you.
Thank you very much, Odile. It is indeed quite a privilege to be amongst the panelists and in the panel that you have set up, and also a rare opportunity to get to interrogate the budget from where I stand, considering my previous life. So pardon me if at times I sound like my previous self. But all in all, as we all did see, and as Maurice has indicated, that a lot of people, the tabling of the budget draws a lot of interest and a lot of comments from all walks of life, because indeed it does touch you know, the lives of all citizens in the country. Now, the task that Tito had in his hands, as some people referred to it as a Herculean task, indeed was a difficult one of tabling a budget at a time like this. What I picked up was that his intention was to try and inspire confidence, hope, but also a call to action, because I think he needs the you know, support of all South Africans in order to be able to implement this, not only his cabinet colleagues. I mean, I would imagine that with the economic outlook that he mapped out, attempts at you know, stimulating economic recovery and dealing with the poor economic situation that predates COVID-19, but then exacerbated by COVID-19, must have been difficult. The unprecedented unemployment numbers that were tabled a few days ago also put him in a quite difficult position. And the underperforming SOEs and stalling of economic reforms that have been on the table by government for a considerable period of time, ranging from, you know, the rolling out of the spectrum and, you know, reducing the cost of doing business, whilst reducing also the cost of living for the ordinary citizens, was also supposed to be addressed. And I would imagine that in more ways than one, there was an attempt to do that in this budget. Of course, as I've said, under very, very difficult circumstances. We've seen his spending programs, and I always am very concerned when I look at where we are spending. As a country, we've always wanted to be a developmental state, but we continue, because of the prevailing social circumstances, finding ourselves in a situation where we do look like we have characteristics of a welfare state. If you look at how much money went into the social services, learning and culture, social development and health. Learning and culture took the biggest chunk at 402 billion, about 403 billion, social development at 335, and health at 248. Added together, that comes to quite a chunk, about half of the budget going in that space. In addition to that, you will also see the debt service cost adding to that burden. leaving very little to go to what should be the fastest growing expenditure item, which is economic development. And that actually, for me, is one of the difficult balancing acts. The budget deficit also continues to haunt our finances, rising to 12% of GDP, but with the gross debt moving now from 65.6% to 80.3% of GDP, does place quite a burden. What remains to be seen is, and there was very little detail on that in the budget, and I hope it will come as we move on, because the implementation of the stimulus package is across government. It's not just the Minister of Finance, but I would imagine that we do need to see more of that, because all of these packages happen to be more in numbers than in reality. So I think it would be useful as we go along to begin to get the details of whether we're still on track with the implementation of our stimulus package, because we expect whatever it is that we do, hinging on the global economic outlook, to begin to dig us out of this situation. We've seen also, as we were approaching this budget, that the country remain in a very precarious position because of all the ratings agencies also having downgraded us. We still remain in junk status. It's going to be quite a tall order to get out of that situation. So I would want to say, the attempt by the minister to do the three things I said earlier of inspiring confidence, inspiring hope, and a call to action were to some extent found in the budget speech. Of course, the comments from various sectors will represent their different interests, be it business, be it labor, or be it political parties, some of whom would also in the political space be just using this as a tool also to bash government. But with those few, I wouldn't want to take all the 15 minutes. I would want more to engage when we start engaging with everybody else. But that's my take, and I would want to leave it at that. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. You're up next.
Thanks, Odile. Technology giving me challenges here. But I think one obviously can only imagine the mammoth task that the Minister of Finance has to go through, trying to build and put together a budget similar to the one that was delivered yesterday. I think when I was going through, scanning through the media yesterday, what I could sense was that a lot of the people were quite impressed with the length and breadth of the budget speech and what came out of it. There was talk of a possible wealth tax that was going to be introduced. A whole lot of people were quite relieved because that never came to pass. But there are three things that I thought were major coming out of the budget speech that I would like to touch on. I think one of them is around the fact that the minister said in so many words that there will not be any additional taxes that are going to be introduced, for reasons that I will ventilate on in a moment. The withdrawal of the 40 billion rand additional revenue that was thought of a couple of, I think about 2 years ago, being withdrawn as well as the reform around corporate taxes. So those are the three things that I think are major that came out of the budget speech that I've briefly touched on. I think talking to the first one around the fact that South Africans are probably one of the most taxed countries in the world. the Minister of Finance acknowledging that we've probably reached the ceiling with regards to the number of additional taxes that can be introduced to try and support government expenditure from a revenue collection perspective. So our collections have, over the past couple of years, been a struggle. I mean, I myself was part of SARS for the past 3 years before joining the private sector, and can vouch for how challenging it is to try and reach the targets as set by the Treasury Department. I mean, our government expenditure is exceeding 200 trillion rand a year, and debt to GDP is set to have moved from 26% during the years when Dr. Trevor Manuel was still the minister to just over 80, and it's predicted to stabilize around 2026 at 88.9. So I think this paints a very bleak picture in terms of revenue collections and the ability of the government to laid hands on revenue, much needed revenue for its expenditure. So the question then remains that if this is really the picture that we are looking at from a revenue collection perspective, what are the options that the minister has or the government has to try and salvage the situation? Obviously, what has been happening over the years is that for the deficit that we experience on a yearly basis, that has been partly funded through borrowing. In the speech yesterday, the minister was at pains to say that they frown at conditionalities that are attached to loans that are issued by institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. So obviously, from a South African perspective, there is uneasiness with regards to the government going that route. So when one looks at where we're sitting from a debt perspective, I do expect that there isn't going to be much movement in that space. So that leaves us with a couple of things that I think needs to be done from a government perspective. One is around fiscal prudence that the minister was talking about yesterday. Proper financial management, I think it's key. One of the things that came out of the budget speech is around zero budgeting. There is apparently going to be a process where they're going to conduct spending reviews across various government departments to look at spending capabilities of a government relative to budget that was provided. And the idea behind that is to make sure that around 2023, the government will be able to recost based on this study, and hopefully come up with efficiencies as well as savings that can be better used elsewhere in its spending plans. There is a public procurement bill that making rounds, and hopefully will also cement controls in that regard. And I suppose findings of the AG also must probably going forward be taken seriously and implemented, so as to make sure that as much of the revenue that is fruitlessly expended is safe and used for much more deserving activities within government. The second thing is around improving enforcement efforts from a SARS perspective. I think a lot has been said around what happened to SARS over the past couple of years, and I'm not going to spend any time on that. In full acknowledgement of the shortage of skills from an audit investigation skills perspective, I think the minister is setting aside about 3 billion rand to try and beef up capability and capacity within the SARS environment. And I think since Professor Kieswetter has joined the organization, he's been quite passionate about the use of data, the use of analytics, the use of machine learning to try and beef up the enforcement capability. So this 3 billion rand that's been put aside, or that's been proposed, will come as much needed, excuse me, much needed relief, I'm sure, for his efforts. And lastly, obviously, all these efforts must be geared at ensuring that we reduce our debt to GDP going forward. So that's the one thing. So the second thing that I said I wanted to touch on is around the fact that the 40 billion rand that we were looking at collecting over the short to medium term has been withdrawn. Those measures that were going to be implemented has been suspended. And I'm hoping that they will be scrapped permanently because, as I said, South Africans have been taxed too much, in my view, and can afford to get any additional taxes imposed. So what is the implication of the withdrawal of these additional tax measures that were thought of initially? Obviously, it does mean that the 40 billion that was envisaged to be collected will now not be collected. It will add to the shortfall from a deficit perspective. Excuse me. So one of the painful things that this has resulted in is the fact that if one looks at the revenue collections for this particular year and in 2022, you'll see that the minister is anticipating that we'll probably have a 1% increase from a revenue collection perspective in 2023, precisely because of the challenges that are painted. And this, if you compare it to the fact that we have been growing at about 6% from a revenue on a year-on-year basis, obviously it's going to put a dampen on the money that or the funds that the government requires for its government expenditure. So I think what then needs to be done, I think it talks to the point that I raised earlier on around we need to look at aspects like the tax gap. I think the Commissioner of SARS estimates the tax gap to be about 10% of our revenue collections on an annual basis. And if one looks at the fact that this year we're probably going to be collecting just over I think it was said to be 1.2 or so trillion rands, then your tax gap will be probably around between 120 and 140 billion South African rands. And if we are able to claw back on that, I mean, measures similar to the additional 40 billion rand that the government was proposing becomes moot, because you'll have more than sufficient revenue to be able to play around with the money from that perspective. So you will realize that in the issues that I'm discussing, they're very much intertwined, and they all boil down to one thing, or a few things that I've highlighted around some of the efficiencies that have to be implemented from a government perspective to make sure that we start clawing back on the tax gap, fruitless and wasteful expenditure from a government perspective, etc. Going forward. And then I'll end there. And then on the last one that I wanted to touch on, being cautious of time, is around reforms around corporate tax. You will be aware that over the years there has been an outcry around the fact that as a country, our corporate tax rate is a lot higher than our peers. For example, other countries in the African continent, the UK as well as Australia, whose tax rates are ranging around 25% or so, and we are down one, and we still have 27. So there is a view that says high corporate tax rates is counter investment, foreign direct investment. And if one looks at the efforts that the president is trying to do through the special initiative where he's trying to draw investors into the country, these are some of the measures that I believe are being put in place to try and make sure that we attract foreign direct investment over and above making sure that the ones that we have, the current investors in the country are kept satisfied, and that they don't disinvest as a result. If one looks at the collections from a corporate tax perspective between the years 2008 until now, I mean, in 2008, corporate tax collections were about 26% of the overall collection from a SARS perspective, compared to 16% in 2020. And one then begins to realize that there has been quite a bit of challenges that are experienced by entities incorporating in South Africa. One, because we believe that they, in the main, have not really recovered from the 2008 recession. Additionally, some of them have been sustaining themselves through some of the incentives that have been issued from the DTR perspective, some of which are currently being withdrawn as a result of reasons that were provided by the minister yesterday. So these are a accumulation of factors that are negatively impacting on the revenue collections that we are realizing from a corporate tax perspective, which I think is one of the reasons why the minister is looking at reducing corporate tax rate. He did mention that this is just part one. He will be looking at other opportunities for such a reduction going forward. One of the reasons why he didn't implement this earlier on is because he wanted to do it in a very tax neutral way, i.e. he wanted to make sure that when he reduces it, he's got other avenues where he's going to be drawing the additional revenue that will be foregoing through the drop in the tax rate. And that this he has done through the two things that he was speaking about yesterday, around limitation on interest deductibility, as well as limitation on assessed losses, which can be carried over to the next financial year. Let me pause there, and then we'll be happy to chat further around these particular topics at the Q&A session part of this discussion. Thank you. Back to you, Odile.
Great, thanks, Leboheng. Kenneth, you're up next, and then we'll have Busi as our last speaker.
All right, thank you very much. And thank you very much to the School of Governance and to the Business School for the opportunity to share our thoughts today. I'm hoping you can hear me, and I'm going to proceed. Okay, so there's really two things I want to talk about today. The one is, when I was asked to do this presentation, I thought, what is it that we talk about when we talk about budgets? And I just want to reflect a little bit about that. And secondly, why is growth such a big policy priority at the moment, and economic growth? So there's just those two topics or subtopics that I want to talk about today. So what do we talk about when we talk about budgets? You know, the South African budget, it raises political questions. It raises tax specialized questions like we've just heard now. It's amazing to watch how the tax specialists come out with their briefing documents a few hours after the budget, year after year, and it's mind-boggling stuff that they're analyzing. Really impressive, like detail, and there's a whole tax world there. There's a world of advocacy as well. There's a world of we need more social grants, we need more money on education, we need more money on health. And that's also very useful in putting political pressure on the system to try and shape the outcomes in the budget. But as an economist, I think there are economic tools that help us to talk about budgets as well. And we should use some of those tools in understanding not the technical taxation, not the politics, not the advocacy, but what are those tools that economics has to offer? I think I'm a macroeconomist, and it really is useful in showing the relationship, theoretical and empirical relationship between key economic variables. Economics has got a toolkit that helps us to identify trade-offs. If you have more of this, you'll have less of that. And trade-offs are very important in the budgeting process. And lastly, the unintended and intended consequences of our actions. That's what we train our economists to understand and to adopt those kind of tools of analysis. So if we start to apply that to the budget yesterday, for example, the relationship between key variables. So if you advocate strongly for increased social grants, and we say we need to have a basic income grant, we need to increase social grants, that when you appeal on the basis of the need that exists in society, those appeals can be extremely strong and can be very appealing. But obviously the consequences of some of that needs to be taken into account. So if we roll out social grants because of those advocacy appeals, but we do it in a way that is going to cause rising debt and the revenue cannot sustain it, then our economic analysis says that at time T, there is one outcome, and time T plus one, we will not be able to sustain these grants. And economists need to speak up when those kind of things become apparent. As you can already see, actually, some of the grants are being rolled back in real terms, and the minister is under pressure for that. Austerity is another term that is, the minister said, this is not austerity, is not austerity, is not austerity. But you know, when I was listening to that, I think there's evidence of some austerity in this budget, and there's evidence that government's trying to avoid austerity. How do we define austerity? As the cutting back of social services, cutting back of delivery of certain items, whether it's in education, education infrastructure. So I think it's a matter of degree. You know, it's not a Manichaean concept of switch on, switch off. there is a degree of austerity in this budget, and I can understand why politically you'd like to resist that. And as Nhlanhla Nene said earlier, the political process hammers away at any kind of a sign of weakness. But in a forum like this, I think we can have an economic analysis and discuss those relationships. Another concept that we talk about when we talk about budgets is consolidation. So if we spend more, so consolidation is a bit of a swear word, austerity, consolidation. There's an assumption that if we spend more, this will be good for boosting aggregate demand, will be good for boosting growth. And this is very true, but it's only true up to a point. And again, economic analysis enables you to try and understand at what point does an increase in expenditure boost demand, and at what point do you cross the line and an increase in expenditure, which is not sustainable because it doesn't have revenue flow sustaining it and is based on borrowing, actually becomes a contractionary, not an expansionary activity. So here there's a distinction between cyclical deficits and structural deficits. So the Keynesian concept of a cyclical deficit says that government must and can borrow and spend more during a downturn. And then when the upturn comes, when the economic growth returns, government will borrow less, will tax more, and will have to spend less. And that's a typical Keynesian cyclical deficit. But in South Africa, what we have now is not a cyclical deficit. We have entered the terrain of having a structural deficit. And this happens when expenditure is planned based on an assumption of high growth, which does not eventuate. So if we've had persistently low growth for a decade or so, but we've continued to budget on the assumption of high growth, you have a situation where your expenditure plans assume a degree of revenue which is not forthcoming due to low growth. And as the minister said yesterday, if you enter the terrain over a period of structural deficit, you land up having to borrow, quote, a lot of money from a lot of people. So we're going deeper and deeper into the structural deficit, and that is not an expansionary strategy either. So we get told that we need to expand and we need to borrow more and spend more, but it becomes a fundamentally contractionary policy if you're having to use your tax revenue to pay higher and higher borrowing costs, and the interest rate on those borrowing costs is increasing as the credit ratings are downgrading. So economic tools enable us to see, well, it might appear to be an expansionary policy, but in fact, this is contractionary because more and more of the tax we're paying every year is now being allocated to repay borrowing costs because we have entered the terrain of a structural deficit. So I think the minister is very clear and the budget is very clear that the structural deficit has to be brought under control. Where I'd like to quibble with that is how does one bring that under control? And that's where I was a bit disappointed in the budget. So that's my second question. It's about growth. Why is growth the number one priority? And I do not think the budget said enough about growth. Growth is important because it is through growth that we can best stabilize. We won't be able to stabilize our fiscal position simply by cutting costs and raising taxes. You know, it's not, we've reached limits on that, and the structural deficit is eating up our fiscal space, and increasingly we're having to repay our debts to many people and our many debts. So growth, is the best way to stabilize our fiscal situation. The growth path is the true expansionary policy that our economy needs for an inclusive growth path. And once you start thinking about growth, it's hard to think about anything else because growth is the way out for the South African economy. We can debate around whether we should spend more on this grant, or whether we should spend more on education, or whether we should tax the rich a bit more or reduce VAT. But all of that is almost like moving the deck chairs around a sinking ship. The growth ship is sinking, and the growth ship is sinking, and the only way to stabilize things is to stop that sinking and to bring growth back into the economy. And so much of our budgetary debate happens on the demand side, the taxes, the spending, how much should we spend, how much should we tax, but there's not enough discussion on the supply side issues. Now, I know it's not the budget's role only to do that. It's a whole of government issue, but I would have preferred much stronger signaling from the minister Not that he is saying it's not austerity and I'm not going to tax you more and I'm not going to spend too much, but saying that the only way out, the message, the signaling, like the president had done in the SONA in some ways, is to move this economy onto a higher growth path. The stylized facts of our supply side at the moment are stark. We have an electricity shortage. We have delays in our energy transition. We've got a 4IR strategy for industrialization and data and digital, but our vested interests are blocking the 5G and data rollout. We've got an infrastructure that is decaying and needs to be maintained and expanded, but there's no clear business plan regarding user pays and how that infrastructure is going to be built. And there's many others, but just those three: electricity, telecoms, and infrastructure. If those three things could be properly resolved, the economy would move on to a higher growth path. If the economy moved on to a higher growth path, there would be more revenue. If there was more revenue, we would have less of a deficit, and you understand, and we'd have a different, we would overcome our structural deficit and move on to a new budgeting platform. So the budget announced yesterday said the growth in 2021 will be 3.3%. Hooray, that's great. 3.3% is much better than it has been in previous years. Obviously, the COVID year, 2020, was minus 7.2%. So, this is a bounce. This is a technical bounce. Nothing profound that we've done to stimulate this growth. It's coming back because lockdown has ended and there's 3.3%. So I'm not going to quibble about 3.3%, but the quibble is in 2022 and 2023, where our growth is going to go back to 1%, 1.6%. Now, surely that is a crisis. That is really a serious crisis, that we are projecting in our budget that the growth is going to be 1.6% in 2023 and 2% in 2022. It's really not good enough. If we are talking about stabilizing our fiscus, that we are not able to project higher growth rates and take action to achieve them. If you look at the history of China, when it moved from ideology to pragmatism, the move from Mao Zedong to Deng Xiaoping, it's a fascinating period and a fascinating pivot of how a country moves and sustains its economic growth rate at over 10%, so at times, for year after year, for decades. And the life-changing effect that has on the people in the economy, where instead of standing on the side of the road, you are able to go and do some work and find some gainful employment. Instead of clearing up, it's fundamental that our economy, our minister stands up and says we're going to grow at 2% next year and 1% the following year, is a fundamental problem in the way that we are approaching this. I know that he hinted at, and so did the president, say, well, we're going to look at the supply side constraints and we're going to look at improving our network sectors. We've got an operation, Vulindlela, which is going to be a joint operation to do all of these, to address all of these things, the pro-growth, structural reform. And that's all well and good. And I think it's a good initiative. This is the idea of a developmental state that Nhlanhla Nene spoke about, not a welfare state, a developmental state that drives growth, includes people in that growth, and overcomes our apartheid and colonial history and all of those things that need to be done as part of that. But, my concern is that this Vulindlela and this transformation has to be both top-down, which is a Vulindlela type thing, and it needs to be bottom-up. Both within government. I'm not sure that the government departments are fully bought into it. They seem to be resisting some of these reforms. It needs to be bottom up within government and amongst the social partners. It needs to be a broad social consensus that growth is the issue, unblocking reforms, and we are going to overcome selfish vested interests, privileges, etc. They're going to be overcome through this consensus. How do we restructure Eskom? How do we unlock growth in the new energy, the new hydrogen economies, 4IR, 5G? Pay for infrastructure, what needs to be done in education? Those issues and linking them to economic growth are crucial, a bit beyond the budget, but it could have been signaled much more strongly in the budget. This is the way out. I was looking at the history of the unification of Germany in the early 1990s, and that society had the vision. We also became a united society in the 1990s, but I don't know if we had the same kind of vision of the compromises that had to be made to unify Germany. They brought the workers into the boardrooms. They sat on the boards of the companies. The unions understood then that there had to be wage restraint in order to become competitive as Germany, to become a workshop of the world. And Germany rebuilt itself up as a united country. I just don't feel that South Africa's crossed that idea of a unified narrative, a unified nation, all working in the same direction. So I think we've still got quite a lot to learn about this and how to unite our country around a project of inclusive growth, which would make our budget discussions very noisy, and we would say more of this and more of that, but at least we'd be not on a sinking ship. We'd be cruising along on the ship, and we'd be arguing politely with each other about what to do. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Kenneth. Before we go to our last speaker, Busi, I'll just remind everyone that you are welcome to post your questions to the panelists in the Q&A. And if you're live streaming on Facebook, you can post your comments there and we'll answer them here. And now over to you, Busi. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here, and thanks to the Wits School of Governance for inviting me to this event. I've been listening to all the other panelists, and it's always great to go last because you get to have the last word on everything. Well, we'll have questions, but it's always great to go last. But I want to talk about, expenditure, the emergency rescue measures, and I want to talk about how this budget perpetuates inequality. And I want to begin with saying that there's no such thing as a pro-growth fiscal consolidation, that this is certainly austerity. And I also understand, that there's an inclination to not call it austerity, because there's something about austerity that is political. It is a political decision. It's not just a technical term. And I think there's a clear resistance to call it that, but I think we need to call a spade a spade. Austerity means the cutting of expenditure to address debt during economic downturns, right? Are we not cutting the budget? Yes, we are. Are we not increasing, or rather implementing regressive taxes? Yes, we are. And that is the ultimate definition of austerity. So I think it is critical that we call it that. And to also acknowledge that, we are being told that there's no alternative. And this is a very powerful economic tool, because it puts us in the corner. Once we all believe that this is the only way out, then of course, this can go ahead. The fiscal consolidation, the extreme fiscal consolidation, I'd call it, will continue to go on. But this is not a new thing. And in fact, in the first paper that I wrote about the cost of austerity, it was discussing how after the global financial crisis, this was the norm, right? After the global financial crisis, many countries across the world, after a brief stimulus, just like we've just had last year, supposed stimulus that is, implemented austerity in pursuit of economic recovery. There was a concerted effort to redefine the global financial crisis into a supposed fiscal crisis, a crisis due to government spending and not the systematic, irresponsible behavior of finance. There was a moral appeal to shared sacrifice, suffering, and collective obligation to correct the failures of the fiscal crisis. And this is how austerity was moralized, made to be the only way out after the financial crisis. And in South Africa, we are going through a similar thing, which is that we are in a health crisis, we are in a socioeconomic crisis. Of course, our economy is in crisis, but fundamentally what is happening is that we are being moralized into believing that we are in this fiscal particular crisis. And I'm going to unpack that a bit, because I think it is critical that people understand the difference between debt as a, absolute debt of what we owe and versus debt servicing costs. And I appreciate the previous comments about growth, right? Because it speaks to this idea that debt is always spoken about relative to GDP, right? It's debt to GDP ratio. And so when we think of the budget, let's think of a pie. The budget is, the economy rather is a pie, and debt is a share of that pie, right? And when we think about this pie, 30% of this pie is made up of government expenditure. That's what, our economy, 30% of GDP is government expenditure. So what happens when you shrink the size of the pie? The share of the debt itself, the total debt, does not decrease. So what happens is that the debt becomes a larger part of the pie. So what happens? Your debt to GDP ratio increases, right? And so that's one of the things about austerity is that, in fact, and even when you look at these countries that implemented austerity, you realize that the debt to GDP ratio didn't actually decline as we're being told to believe, right? Because there's no such thing as, again, a pro-growth fiscal consolidation. There's something about, if we understand the economics of how government spend itself, is a critical component. Even if we go back to economics 101 formula, GDP is equal to consumption plus investment, government expenditure is a critical part. So now going to expenditure, I think it is important that we acknowledge how, the fact that consolidated non-interest spending is going to contract on average at the average rate of 5.2% in real terms. So we are shrinking, non-interest expenditure. Non-interest expenditure is all spent besides debt servicing costs. And I think why it's important to really focus on this is because even in the document itself, the National Treasury acknowledges how this is going to be detrimental to our economy, right? In fact, in the budget 2020, they acknowledge that accelerating budget cuts will lead to, a decline in service delivery, and that it will actually harm the economy. So there's this idea around, these short-run costs, how we all have to, for intergenerational, equity or whatnot, we all have to shoulder these costs in the short run. But I want to put it here that we cannot say that human rights are more important tomorrow than they are today. Human rights are important today. And the National Treasury, if we believe that the Constitution of South Africa is the supreme law of this country, it is also important that we must recognize that Treasury falls within that Treasury is not above the Constitution. So what happens when our National Treasury says to us, without justification, because they haven't justified to us why this is the only way out? I don't think I've been sufficiently convinced. I don't think they've explored all the possible economic policy tools, monetary and fiscal policy tools. I don't think they've even explored a potential growth strategy that would actually work. And instead, what they're saying to us is that we have to sacrifice, yet at the same time on the end, they're not really coming to the table. And again, when we talk about expenditure, I think it's also important that yes, it's already been acknowledged that the fiscal can't solve all our growth issues, but I think we can use our fiscus to really drive that growth and, equitable growth. It's also about what kind of growth do we want? For instance, I'll give you an example, which is generally overlooked. ITUC shows that if we invested 2% of our, of GDP into the health and care economy, right? Unpaid care work, which is conducted mainly by women, but also the care economy for the elderly, the youth, the young, which a lot of people ignore, we could actually generate 400,000 jobs. So how do we begin to think differently about what is the society that we want to create and what kind of mechanisms and investments need to take place to get there? So I think this is important as well because, we need to we're working backwards. We're starting, if our point of departure is that our budget is constrained, we can't do things, then we're obviously going to dream low. We're going to aim low. We're going to be here. But I think it's important that we step back and say, what South Africa do we want? What do we want our society to look like? What is a transformed South Africa and how do we get there? Because right now it's just treading in the dark with hopes that we'll reach this supposed outcome, but it's not even clear what this outcome is going to look like. I think also the next one is emergency rescue measures. I think it is critical that we acknowledge that the 500 billion that never was is what I like to call it now. Our estimates at the Institute for Economic Justice show that only a third of the 500 billion package has been utilized or was utilized last year. So it is very important to me when I look at the budget and I see that National Treasury does not even refer to the 500 billion, not even once, yet they are gone into full-blown recovery mode. There will be no recovery without rescue. The first step is rescue. People are suffering now. Again, this whole in the future, we will have better outcomes. No, people are suffering today. Our economy is suffering today. Businesses are failing today. Municipalities are going bankrupt today. And so it's important that we rescue now so that we can build the foundation for future recovery. Without that foundation, I don't know what we're going to recover from. We'll have to recover from a very different South Africa than what we had, even prior to COVID. And it was important that we preserved, even as imperfect as it was important that we at least preserved what we had so that we could build from there. And then I want to talk about human solidarity, and sacrifice, because I think the poor are obviously the ones who are most hard hit here in this budget. The vulnerable are the ones who are going to be hard hit. We are, we are reducing social grants. I really dislike it when people say South Africa is a welfare state, because the social grants are really targeted at children, the elderly, people with disabilities and so forth. And so, it's only now that we have a grant that is targeted at 18 to 59 adults. But in South Africa, traditionally, our welfare system has taken care of those who are vulnerable and those who are not able, actually not within the working range or are unable to work. So I think it is important that we do not call South Africa a welfare state, because it is not, and it hasn't been. And I think there's political implications to calling South Africa a welfare state. Just like we don't want to say it's austerity, or government doesn't want to call it austerity, I think it's equally important that we make sure we use those right words. But I think, again, the poor are the ones who are taking the brunt of this. In the budget this year, in this budget, they talk about how cutting spend on the public sector wage bill in education is going to result in less teachers and teacher shortages, and this will impact no-fee paying schools the most. I don't think as people we can sit here and say it is okay for poor students to have worse learning outcomes because the budget must be resolved. I don't think that's adequate. I think there has to be a way that solutions have to be driven. I really think that the National Treasury here has said, we're going to take a step back, we're going to resolve this, budget, but at the cost of the poor and the vulnerable. Those are the people going to be hardest hit. Unemployment has reached a high in South Africa, yet we are cutting, those grants that 17 million plus people, children, elderly, again, I'm going to reemphasize this, children, elderly, people with disabilities rely on, right? And those people are vulnerable and we have to protect those people. It is actually the fault of our government that so many people actually rely on these grants. It is a problem of systematic failure to resolve the issues. And then the last thing I want to talk about is this tax. One, I don't agree that we should have a corporate tax cut. If you look at the data that has been presented between 2009, or at least after the financial crisis, between 2009 and 2019, there's a great study about how a lot of countries, emerging markets, implemented tax cuts to stimulate the economy, and how that actually did not boost investment as they thought that would happen, right? It makes economic logic, but to say that it does not play out like that in real life, and what they find is that it actually just increases inequality. I think in South Africa, there are a lot of businesses, and you can argue whether all of them or not, that are making excessive wealth. Are we protecting excessive wealth? There's a clear need for redistribution in South Africa. I don't think we should be participating in the race to the bottom for corporate tax rates. I think actually on a global front, we should not be doing this whole race to the bottom thing. But I also think in this budget, the tax rebates obviously favor people who are higher income earners and the holders of wealth. So there's a clear inequality that is being perpetuated in this budget. And I'm going to wrap up now because I think I've run out of time, but to say that, it is very important that we do not hide behind technicalities of economics when real lives are being impacted on the ground, when real people are the ones who are going to be on the receiving end of this. And I think with my last point is to say that I think we need to hold National Treasury more accountable than we've ever done. National Treasury first said they're going to resolve our debt in 2012. It is almost a decade later. That they haven't reined in that debt. And I think it is important that we ask them, why not? Why haven't they delivered on that? And why is it that now because of all this failure to do so over time, we're now at a place where certain people, the vulnerable, are the ones who are going to have to shoulder the costs. And so again, that's my end point on that. And yeah, looking forward to the questions.
Perfect, thank you, Busi, useful insights there. So we'll move on now to the Q&A or discussion section of this webinar. And I'll just remind everyone again to post your questions in the Q&A or to post them in Facebook if that's where you are watching from. So I'll start with Busi because you just ended off. So you spoke about National Treasury sort of asking us to come to the table, and yet they are not doing the same. And you also speak about holding them accountable, right? So we've seen so many finance ministers since, you know, the last few years. How do you think we hold someone accountable, you know, when the people keep changing? So the ministers keep changing. How do we hold them accountable when we have that sort of thing happening?
That's a very difficult question. I think about that a lot because that's what I deeply want to do. And there's many things. It also goes back to, you know, we in South Africa we like to use the word social compacts. Social compacts. We need social compacts, but these social compacts are just so exclusionary, right? And there are generally no mechanisms for accountability. You know, real accountability. And so I think about, you know, do we challenge austerity in courts? You know, the Constitutional Court might not take this on. I don't know. Maybe it's not possible, but I really think, yeah, that is a difficult question. And I think it's one that we have to approach in power, like when we analyze power, it's about the political settlement and how power is reproduced over and over again. Just like this budget is reproducing a certain type of power, right? It's reproducing a power that is disenfranchising poor people, you know, and putting them on the sidelines. It's the same power that's being reproduced within how decisions are made themselves, right? There's a power, there's a gendered power, there's a racialized power, there's a capitalistic political settlement power that's being reproduced. And what does that mean? It fundamentally means you're not going to have Vusi and take Vusi seriously when you are trying to reproduce a certain power, right? You're not going to have Vusi in the room who's going to tell you that, you know, obviously these expenditures have to increase. And so I don't know, I don't have a direct answer about how we hold Treasury accountable, how we hold government as a whole accountable. I think, yeah, I think about the power dynamics all the time. Even as an economist, I feel disempowered, actually, to be able to meaningfully engage my government on these issues using the expertise that I have.
Thanks. Lebogang, I'll give this question to you. It's from the chat. Someone said, what are the expectations of a lower corporate tax rate, and shouldn't there be a fear that corporations are more likely to divert those savings to shareholders or executives rather than stimulus or sort of distributing it to workers, as some people have mentioned would be a likely outcome of that?
Thanks, Odile. I think it's interesting that Busi was saying that there's research to the effect that in some countries there is evidence that you know, a reduction in corporate tax has not resulted in the gains that the Treasury believes it will be gained out of a reduction in corporate tax. And I think the logic really behind it has always been that the belief, I suppose, by those who subscribe to the principle that one of the reasons why we are struggling as a country with foreign direct investment is because, amongst others, the fact that our corporate tax rate is a lot higher than our peers, as I said, the likes of other African countries, as well as the UK, as well as us. So that belief is premised on the fact that you know, investors have the choice with regards to which country to invest in, and they are a lot likely to invest in countries where they believe that there is shareholder value, as an example, as well as obviously there's a social impact aspect of formulating a business. So the Treasury's belief, I believe, is premised on exactly that, i.e. that there is evidence to the effect that a reduction in corporate tax does have that effect of leading to in part to countries wishing, companies or corporates deciding to invest in a particular country. As with anything, I mean, there's studies to the contrary, but there's also studies that support that viewpoint. And I think that's probably the viewpoint that Treasury has taken. And I suppose, granted that there's always going to be a viewpoint that Treasury should have done things better, but I suppose the individuals who are sitting and formulating this type of policies have chosen to go with the view that says there is support for that type of thinking, and we are struggling to draw people into the country from an investment perspective. If one looks at the drive that the president is trying to do to try and get people into the country, one of the things that these multinationals are saying is a struggle for them is ease of doing business in the country. I mean, we ranked just over 86, and their plan is to move us down to just below 50. And I suppose there is that belief, as I said, that that reduction will help us to get to the sub 50 ease of doing business rating, and on the World Bank ease of doing business. But I'm sure Busi will hold a different view.
Thank you. Nhlanhla, maybe I'll ask you. So Ulebogeng talks about, wanting to draw FDI into the country. A lot of people have said that corporate South Africa actually sits on a lot of wealth. What do you think this sort of decrease in the long term of company income tax will mean for them? Will it not mean that, we're giving them more room to hold on the supposed wealth of them?
Thanks, Adil. Firstly, just to agree with Olebogeng, that indeed its intention, the intended objective is to attract FDI, yes. But also with the South African domestic investors, the intended objective is again to for this to serve as an incentive for them to invest. And as they invest, because nobody would want to sit on a pile of cash and expect that cash to generate any returns. Investment decisions are taken based on an environment that is conducive to good returns, and also being able to grow your business. Anybody that is in business will tell you that it would be no reason to sit on cash if there are business opportunities and there's a conducive environment to make good returns. And I would imagine if with a small tax incentive like this, it should actually serve as an incentive to invest more, to create jobs, and to make better returns, which would be a win-win. I think there are a number of other things that actually are taken into account, including policy uncertainty that has, held us back for a long period of time, including our inability to move with the structural reforms that have been on the table. And I hope that there is now going to be, some movement in that space, because we've been hearing about the release of the spectrum. We've been hearing about a number of other things that would reduce the cost of doing business and the cost of living for our citizens. All of those need to be implemented and be executed in order to attract this investment. It's not only the tax, the corporate tax reduction that is going to attract investment. There are quite a number of other factors that need to be taken into account.
Okay. Kenneth, this question is for you based on your presentation. So we all know that the finance minister has to walk the fine line between politics and economics. And you spoke about electricity generation, telecoms and infrastructure as some of the factors that need to be taken seriously for a growth path. That obviously, as we know, is capacity that lies within our SOEs. What does the minister do here, right? He can't necessarily decide what happens to those SOEs. And we all heard also that, the minister didn't speak about the resources that are being given to the SOEs, but those have rather sort of been hidden in the fine print documents. What do you make of that?
All right, thanks. My head is spinning a bit. There's so much I want to say, and every time I finish speaking, I want to say more. But I'll try and focus my mind a little bit here. So, on some of the issues that have come up, our constitution, when we wrote our Bill of Rights, back in '96 and that, we said that we're going to progressively realize access for everyone to healthcare, to education, to social security. And the implicit assumption in all of that was that our economy would be growing, and as it grew, there'd be more resources available and we could expand those things. And it really makes you very angry and frustrated to think, well, what have we done? How have we taken this economy into 10 years now of negative GDP per capita growth, more or less. I might be exaggerating, but it's in many of those 10 years, we've had negative growth for people, GDP per capita, and it's very serious. So there's two things. The one is the external factors, and partly the external environment has been very difficult. There was the crisis of 2009, 2008, and then there was the decline in the minerals prices. So there were external excuses and valid excuses that have led us to 10 years of growth being very low. But there's also been terrible internal errors, internal things that we've done. The corruption we all know about. I heard a story from Mabopane the other day where people went to install fiber at the schools. I'm sure you all saw that. And then the local toughs wouldn't allow it. They said, no, we've got our own businesses here supplying people with data and stuff. We don't want fiber in these areas now. It's just going to mess up our business. And that's a small micro story of the kind of vested interests that are holding us back. There's big white established business, there's lower level things that are going on. And these vested interests that say, no, we don't want you to auction a spectrum because it's not going to be good for our business. And they'll take it to court and they'll stop the process. Similarly with the energy side of things, there's been vested interests that have been stopping us from, the whole world is going through an energy transition. We're going through an energy transition. And the world is moving from building big coal power stations to distributing solar and wind energy, and not just in South Africa, it's everywhere it's happening. But we had a successful program going and it was stalled, and there were forces within the state capture that said, no, this is not good. We want to carry on with Eskom and we want to make Eskom great, etc., etc. Whereas structurally, it's like saying that the South Africa must connect we must build phone booths in every area, on every corner, and then everyone will have access to technology. The technology has changed. We use cell phones now. The energy technology has changed. We have to allow that process. It has to be led. We have to allow the technology to change and the way that electricity is generated to happen. So you say, yes, what can the government do? The government has to lead us through that process. I'm still a big proponent of consultation, of top-down, bottom-up social compacting to get through these things, because it can't really be done by stealth. We have to get buy-in so that when a group of local thugs stop us from doing something, there is a proper understanding that this must be done, and we must allow this to be, or when it's a group of thugs in suits sitting in a Sandton boardroom who are stopping things, they can also be ordered that this has to be allowed to take place. So those are the internal things that are stopping us, from actually advancing our constitutional vision that there'll be more resources available to uplift our people. Those resources are really not being made available because we don't have growth. And the other last point is that I think we must be careful about how much we discount the future. Obviously we all live in the moment, but we mustn't discount the future too much. So when we're planning our budget, when we're planning our growth, we have to plan for what does this mean down the line? We can't just live in the current. I mean, I know we're all in crisis in the current, but if we make mistakes, that will be deepened if we're not thinking about, and the literature talks about that. What is our discount rate? It can't be, we can't overly discount the future. We have to value that future as well, or we're going to land up in a situation where we get into a perpetual cycle of decline.
Great, thanks. Uleboheng, there's a question in the chat here that I'll give to you. It says South Africa has a huge problem with illicit cigarettes, and increasing sin taxes ultimately gives, that black market more space to thrive. What do you think should be done to try and level the playing field, between like the formal traders and these illegal traders who, sort of don't need to pay these taxes?
Thanks, Odile. So the challenges around illicit trade, especially in the excise of a product, have been with the organization CourtSARS for quite some time now. I think for prior to 2014, just before the change in commissioner from the Estwal to Ndate Tomoyan, there were a couple of units that were inside the organization that looked specifically at the capping of illicit trade, and I think the disbandment of that unit led in many ways to the upsurge in illicit trade, because you all understand that the taxes that are generated out of your tobacco or alcohol is quite high, and one being able to circumvent the payment of such would lead to one being able to sell their product at costs that are at prices that are a lot less than competition. So there is a constant tussle in the industry around the two organizations, I think FITA and TISA, who are constantly at each other's throats around the fact that one accusing the other of being, drivers of illicit trade and all that. But I think the solution is rather to the problem is the two organizations coming to a discussion point around how best do they ensure the safety of or secure their businesses, as well as at the same time ensuring that there is minimization of illicit flow of goods into the country. There was at some stage many years back an effort to that effect, but I think discussion between the organizations have came to a discord, and I'm aware that there hasn't been any engagement between the two to try and meet each other halfway. And I think over and above that, I think efforts from the SARS perspective to try and beef up their audit and investigation skills will go a long way in trying to reduce the levels at which we are seeing illicit trade. And I think the lockdown period has also exacerbated the problem. But hopefully, in the short to medium term, with the allocation of the 3 billion from the Minister of Finance, we're going to start seeing some progress in that regard. But I do acknowledge that it's a huge problem that we're sitting with. And I think there is an estimation that there's about 7 billion only in the tobacco industry that is to be regarded as a tax gap, that if clawed back will help obviously government with its spending efforts going forward. Thanks.
Great. Busi, you spoke a bit about social grants. Someone in the chat says, under the current economic collapse in South Africa and the world, what would be a lasting solution for social grant recipients? My understanding is that social grants were meant as a temporary measure and not meant to be permanent. And I suppose that argument is factually true, especially for the COVID-19 relief grant, which is the first of its kind. What is your solution for this going into the future? Do we continue with this grant as a permanent grant, given that we have chronic unemployment? And what also happens to the growing number of social grant recipients who are part of the vulnerable population?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I mean, again, I guess the logic was that you would have a working age population that would be able to, make money, and therefore you wouldn't necessarily need to help families. But I think, it's always difficult to answer this question because one, yes, there can be more employment in the South African economy, but in 2015, there was a study that showed that 54% of working people in South Africa still earned below the working poverty line, which was 4,100 and something at the time. So in fact, we need to think differently, that employment is not necessarily a panacea solution, actually. Just the creation of employment itself, but how do we think about living wages, right? The only way that those groups who cannot work, right? Children cannot work, the elderly cannot work, people with disabilities cannot work. Those people, right, would rely on people who are able to work. But those people who are working then need living wages. I'm a big proponent of a universal basic income grant. And the reason is, one, I think every human being, whether they're able to work or not, should have access to their basic needs. I don't feel like, sometimes I joke and I say I'm a post-work economist, but really, I do think my dream future life is not to work. I actually think work is a bit outdated, although we need it. I know we need it, but I think it is important that we think differently about what kind of societies do we want to create. And I think also universal basic income grant is very progressive when we think about the unpaid care work, which is generally undertaken by women or largely undertaken by women. We know that, for instance, when women undertake unpaid care work, it takes time away from them from being able to actually find jobs, right? Who is producing the labor force? We need to think about how do we compensate that labor, right? That is not in the formal labor market. And so when we think about employment as the only way to generate incomes for living, we exclude or we think from an economic man perspective. We don't think about how that labor is reproduced. We don't think about the people who are actually unable to work. We don't think about an alternative, a different alternative. I know people are going to say it's idealistic, but again, that's why I mentioned this earlier, that what kind of society are we trying to create? What kind of inclusive, intersectional society are we trying to create? And therefore that then informs how we understand, how we theoretically understand what we're trying to reach, informs our policy responses. If we want a South Africa where every single human being works, then we'll have a different set of policy prescriptions for people to all have income so that, everyone has money. So I think, again, the social grants to me, also just my last point about this is that social grants are generally misunderstood. Most of them, if not all of them, I'm going to quickly look at my table here. Most of them, or rather the critical ones, the child grant one, still fall under a number of them still fall under the upper bound poverty line. We are giving people just enough. The child grant is not even at the food poverty line level of 585 Rand a month. So even when we talk about social grants, I think it is important that we contextualize what value actually, like what are they worth in our economy, right? Like we can complain about them all we want, but what value are we giving those households is also a very critical discussion that we need to have.
Right, thanks. Nhlanhla, you answered a question about the unemployment here. While we are not yet in Busi's post-work economy, we still have this chicken and egg situation happening with unemployment and economic growth. Given the sort of stark numbers that have been given for 2022, 2023, if you're saying that the solution to our unemployment problem is economic growth, but our economic growth is looking the way it does, do you think we're looking at moving towards 50% for our official unemployment rate in the next few years?
Look, I think talking about economic growth, and that's what Kenneth has actually always been emphasizing, that the solution to all our problems, actually, not only unemployment, is actually growth. But it should be growth also that is not only, I did say it must be focused to labor intensive sectors, but also it must be growth that actually creates an environment where it's actually a creation of sustainable livelihoods, where people are able to survive not only through employment, but are also able to sustain themselves. Because at the end of the day, it's not only, if everybody is employed, we should be asking the question as to who's going to be employing everyone if everybody is employed. We want everybody employed, but then the chicken and egg situation also arises here, where there should be employers as well. But who are the employers? And that is why a particular focus on small, medium enterprises is critical, and also creating an environment where innovation is actually encouraged, where people should be able, and I know of a number of people, and a lot of them in the space where I am as a small-scale farmer here, who actually survive entirely because they actually farm the land, which actually, even with the failure in our land reform process, who are able to sustain themselves just through subsistence and small-scale agriculture. Other businesses also can be able to survive through that. A lot of small businesses also, even in the retail space, are actually quite doing well for people who are prepared to earn a living and be able to lift themselves out of poverty without waiting for government handouts. Of course, the Social Security plays a critical role in actually just giving people a lift up out of poverty, but we cannot expect that to be the be it and be all. At the end of the day, people should be able to be given an opportunity to be able to sustain themselves.
All right. Kenneth, you spoke a bit about top-down and bottom-up consultation. Someone in the chat says, in these budget processes, social stakeholders speak past each other. How do we actually get more listening and meeting of minds, especially given ideological contestation?
Yes, so that's actually, as I started, I said, what do we talk about when we talk about the budget? It really opens up a whole lot of different issues. And it's all legitimate, you know, and so you would, if you are somebody working in the area of social grants, you don't want to see these whittled away, and you have a vision for improving those things. If you are a tax person, you want to make sure that business is not taxed too much because you want to improve investment and et cetera, et cetera. If you are working if you're in the defense force, you are worried about the fact that that your budget allocations are falling, how you're going to run your machinery, how you're going to pay for uniforms. You know, it's like it's an instrument that everyone has a stake in, is this budget. You know, it affects everybody. It affects your pocket, it affects your future, it affects everything. So I don't think we can ever get it to a point where ideology is removed from it or politics is removed from it. But I think that the trick of leadership is to provide a vision that we can all, at least a critical, we used to talk about sufficient consensus. There'd be sufficient consensus that this is the vision for our society. This is how we move from this point that we're in towards another point. And this is how we use our instruments, whether it's our tax or whether it's our expenditure, to achieve those things. That's really the trick of leadership. And I do think that that leadership can't be done, as I said, by stealth or just top down. It needs to be leadership through society. The churches, the trade unions, the business leaders all need to have a part of that vision. When I spoke about the unification of Germany, you know, that was quite a profound thing, where the workers in the factories in West Germany suddenly realized they were very vulnerable to East German workers. Those were very skilled workers in East Germany, but they were at a very much lower wage. And they were vulnerable, their jobs were vulnerable, you know, to a relocation. Once the Berlin Wall fell, the movement of capital across into those highly skilled, low-wage areas of Eastern Europe, including East Germany. And there was an assessment of that situation, and they didn't look at their interests today as protecting everything they had today. They looked at, well, what is our vision for Germany? We want to unify Germany, and we want to ensure that we are able to have workers in auto factories in various parts of this, on the east and on the west, and we build up a strong country that way. So yes, that's why I keep on talking about that. There's no way around it for me. You know, we don't want a strong leader who's able to stand on TV and shout at us and tell us what we must do and divide our nation. There's a lot of divisiveness in the leaders or in the tin pot leaders or people that we see. You know, they're just trying to say, well, we'll lead our group and the other group is evil, and we will make sure we keep them in their place. That is really not a good way for us to go, and we're very vulnerable to that. You know, I think our society has a very violent society. There's a breakdown in law and order in many ways. There's gender violence. There's so many real dangers. And that's why this leadership, and not just one man must lead us or one woman, it needs to be broad-based, where we can start signaling that this is the road we're on, this is where we hope to be. I know the National Development Plan tried to do that, but I think there wasn't sufficient consensus built around that, and we've had crises that have intervened in the interim. You know, so I don't know. I don't know if it's the only way to do it, but it's the only way that I can think that will work, is if we embark on such a program.
All right. So Nhlanhla, you've obviously walked this tightrope that Kenneth's also talking about. And you spoke about labor. Someone says a lot of the labor market opportunities are skewed towards low wage opportunities. Busi also spoke about people being paid poverty wages. It obviously doesn't help if we employ people, but they still remain in poverty. And then someone just says, why can't the state just employ those who are unemployed as an employer of last resort?
It's an interesting one, Odile. It's like, you know, I've sat in meetings where people have also said, why doesn't the state just give everyone I remember there was a figure, somebody said, why doesn't the state just, instead of budgeting for a year, just give everyone R1 million? And I asked that person to take the calculator and calculate what that will give him, R1 million for 50 million people. And the calculator showed an error, which means you can't arrive at a figure. But I think the difficulty here is finding the right balance. The trade-off between government trying to do everything with resources, limited resources, or with the government trying to encourage everyone to do something so that we can build resources where government would be able to find money, because the only source of revenue for government is taxes. In addition to taxes, it would be borrowing. And beyond that, and these are all some of the things that are hanging around government's neck to be able to try and meet the requirements of individuals. And it is also very difficult to measure the productivity of labor within the state, because as you would know, that the type of work that they do is actually not easy to quantify in order for the state to be able to see exactly what a form of productivity we are seeing in that space. So I would imagine that indeed, this should be a collective and symbiotic relationship between the state and the private sector to create employment. But again, for civil society itself to be able to begin to look at how best we could actually survive without, as I said, without relying on employment. So the so-called formal employment, because informal employment actually constitutes quite a sizable portion of our economy in the country, and we have not been able to quantify that. And these are some of the areas that we should actually be focusing a lot on. But also, whilst the state is indeed, a large employer, but that is not where the resources are located in order for the state to be the largest employer. At the end of the day, our gross domestic product is actually in the hands of the private sector more than anything. And it's going to be very difficult to change that structure such that it is in the hands of the state for the state to reallocate those resources. There are quite a number of ways that the state reallocates those resources, but as things stand, I think it's a collective effort that is required here between the state, the private sector, and civil society to make sure that we actually all are economically active for the benefit of the broader society.
Okay. Olebogeng, Nhlanhla talks about the taxes being like the main source of revenue. You've obviously said that we are overtaxed in our country, and you are in favor of the reduction in taxes in the long term. Where should the state get its money? So if we do want to attract more FDI, how do we get resources from that? But also someone asks, what about the Reserve Bank? Can that not also be a source of finance? Can we not harness domestic resources like the private and public pension funds and direct it to sustainable development?
Okay, so I suppose I can talk to the tax part of it, and we'll ask Ntathinene to maybe chip in with regards to the Reserve Bank and all that. But as I mentioned earlier on, I think the biggest challenge that we currently have is that based on current capabilities that SARS has, there's only so much one is able to collect from a revenue perspective. And that hasn't really improved over the past a couple of years. The one thing that everybody seems to agree on is that SARS's collection efforts are not optimal, i.e. there is money that we are leaving on the table that we're not able to get to because from a skills perspective, we're not where we're supposed to be. And that's in the format of the tax gap that I spoke to earlier on. And I think the only solution to that particular problem is, SARS needs to have a model that continuously refreshes the resources that they have with a mix from the private sector, so as to ensure that the technical expertise that one gains from being employed in the private sector is also used optimally by government to get to the root cause of this problem that we're setting off with, which is 120 billion South African rands that we're not able to get to from that perspective. And I think that 3 billion, if it were to be used optimally, it would be through a mix of the use of technology, which is granted, as well as sourcing very good resources in the private sector to try and help in this fight to get to reduce the tax gap, which is that 120 billion that I'm talking about. And without that type of approach to the problem, I do not see how the government will be able to claw back on that 120 billion. And the reason why I'm talking to a continuous refresh of the resources is because it's a moving target. I mean, the private sector or whoever is working on these schemes that SARS is unable to decipher is continuously improving themselves in terms of their knowledge, technology, and skills. And it's the same thing that as government, SARS needs to do continuously in order to keep at pace with progress that's been made with regards to this tax gap that I'm talking about. Outside of that, I don't see us winning where that is concerned. Commentary on the Reserve Bank.
I can talk.
I would like to defer that to maybe Kenneth or Professor to talk about.
Kenneth?
Yeah, I'm sure Nhlanhla also has something to say, but I'll start the ball rolling because it's a very interesting and topical question. And we haven't spoken about it very much today, the coordination of fiscal and monetary policy. And we need to try and see what can be done in that regard. During the COVID crisis at the very beginning, the Reserve Bank, you might remember, took the step of purchasing government bonds, okay? And it was, they were purchasing them in the secondary market, meaning that they went into the market and they started buying South African government bonds. And it was quite a big deal. It was a form of kind of, whether it was some kind of unorthodox process that hadn't been done before. And the question arises, well, what is that all about? What was the Reserve Bank doing and why did they do it? And if you look at their reasoning, they basically said that the South African government at that time was trying to borrow money so that it could do all of these things that we had budgeted to do. As Nhlanhla said, you can either borrow or tax, and we have to borrow billions of rand every week. And that's why we're getting into this very big debt to pay salaries and to pay for services and to pay for grants. So the Reserve Bank had to buy government bonds because when the South African government went to sell its bonds, the market wasn't liquid, as they say, meaning that nobody really wanted to buy the South African bonds, which is a major problem. It's a major problem because if your debt, and now it wasn't only our fault again, I keep saying it's half our fault and half the international environment's fault. At that moment, the COVID was really frightening. And it wasn't just that they didn't want South African bonds. There was what they call risk off generally. There was risk off. These bond guys they were scared to buy anything. They didn't want to part with their cash. They didn't feel like giving the cash to anyone. And at that very moment, we were trying to sell our debt and no one wanted to buy it. And the Reserve Bank had to step in just to keep the wheels turning and say, okay, don't worry, guys. We will stand here and we will buy this stuff and there'll always be a market for this. So if you buy from the South African government and you need, on the secondary market, we'll buy it from you. You won't be stuck with this if you don't really want it. So that was a very crude and important moment of coordination, because if the Reserve Bank had held its nose and said, no, we will never do that, we would have had a major crisis because we would have run out of money. The fiscus would have run out of money. And we would have said, well, there's no money for grants this month. And there's no money for anything, salaries for WITS. I work for WITS, so do you. And we get our salaries ultimately from, I suppose, from the government and from fees and things like that. And there would have been a major crisis. So that was the first moment of serious coordination of some kind of QE, quantitative easing type activity, where the Reserve Bank stood to help fiscal policy directly. So then the question arises, shouldn't they just do that all the time? Why don't they just do that all the time? Because then we don't have to worry. We don't have to borrow money from people in New York or from, we don't have to sell our bonds to New York and Tokyo and Frankfurt and London. We don't have to sell them to Sanlam and Old Mutual. Whenever the government needs money, it can just go get the money from the Reserve Bank. And then we don't even need to have this webinar really, because there won't be any money problems, because the Reserve Bank can simply just give the money to to the government, and the government can just spend on everything we want. And it sounds like a really good idea initially until you think about it more deeply. And there is a school of thought in America. There's this modern monetary theory which is saying just that. You can do that for as long as you like, and the only danger, the monetary theory school says, if there's inflation, then you'll stop doing that. So you'll do it until there's inflation, and then you'll stop doing that. And they don't really go into how difficult it will be to stop doing that in America. If you've already said we're going to give people money for this and teachers and there's contracts, they said you'll just stop doing that when there's inflation. But we are not in America, you know, so we've got an additional complication. And our additional complication is that we have got, the Rand is now 60 years old. So we've got our Rand currency, but international trade is not done in Rand. So if you buy something from overseas, you have to pay for it in hard currency, in dollars or euros or something like that. So if we had to do something very experimental on the monetary side, like saying, well, the Reserve Bank will just pay for all the fiscal policy that we have, we'll have a situation where we start, the Rand itself will be called into question. So people will not want to exchange dollars for Rands at this rate. And the Rand will rapidly become devalued. And we will find that this becomes a contractionary thing on our very contractionary adventure, because our interest rates will shoot up very dramatically, because there will be a loss of credibility in our currency. And people will not want our currency anymore. We've seen it in our northern neighbors. They don't want the currency anymore. So you then have to then dollarize your economy, etc. So what I'm trying to get at is that there was a fine line at the beginning of the COVID crisis where the Reserve Bank started to intervene to assist fiscal policy. But like I said in my initial input, there's always limits to how far, when does an expansionary activity become contractionary? When you cross a certain line. And it'll be expansionary for a few months, and it'll become a major contraction on the economy because we won't have those capital flows. Our exchange rate will become very weak. Everything we import will be much more expensive. And our poor people will be poorer, and our rich people will be poorer. But many of them have already hedged themselves, the rich people. They already have dollar-based hedged savings, etc., etc. So that is the Reserve Bank has a role to play. But it's a limited role. It's a role that must be done. So when we talk about the consequences, what are the unintended consequences? It can support, but if it goes too far in that support, it becomes a major hindrance on our development project.
Busi, do you have a different view to Kenneth?
Yeah, I'd just like to add, I think, I mean, the main part I disagree with is the limited role. I think if we're going to have a developmental state, it is critical that we also have a developmental South African Reserve Bank, right? And I think they're generally these sorts of areas that I think we need to discuss. I think one, monetary policy should reinforce fiscal policies, not the contractionary policies, of course, but it is important that our monetary policy and our fiscal policies work together. I mean, even in Economics 101, they talk about how fiscal policy and monetary policy need to work together to make the economy work. In South Africa, there's a disconnect between these two entities, or rather, the one is stagnating based on a particular understanding, which is the SARB, and it is very constrained in its function, whereas the fiscal policy has moved more than what SARB would usually do. And then I think the other thing is that SARB should be amended to include employment targeting. I don't understand how that is not one of the mandates. I think it is critical that SARB have that mandate as part of what it does. But I also just think it is very important that, we think differently about monetary policy. I know that obviously there are, modern monetary theory has its own limitations and so forth, but that does not mean that, there shouldn't be a space to explore other monetary policy tools that are available. And there are so many monetary policy tools that can be explored. I think, of course, like inflation targeting is like the norm. What SARB does is like textbook 101, what a Reserve Bank should do. But I certainly think we should be looking at non-orthodox ways of, engaging with SARB. But I also just think that, I think we need to think about how SARB can, can finance, actually, that's the last one, is can finance fiscal expansion, because we can see what again, this disconnect is perpetuating something, right? Because Treasury has said our constraint is what we believe, right? Our constraints are revenue, our constraints are whatnot. So they've got a list of what their constraints are. But again, because there's a disconnect between SARB and Treasury, it means that, you know, there's almost like I call it a glass ceiling perception of what our limitations are, because there's certainly more to it than that. And yeah, so that's what I'll end on, to say that we cannot have a developmental state without having a developmental South African Reserve Bank.
Kenneth?
No, I think that is, let somebody else speak and I'll speak later.
I just wanted to add one thing to what Kenneth said about the role of the South African Reserve Bank, in that, you know, it is indeed, as Busi has also pointed out, it is indeed the proper coordination of both the fiscal and monetary policy. And in my view, I actually do not pick up any disconnect between the two, because at the end of the day, and that's why those engagements between the minister and the governor of the Reserve Bank become critical on a continuous basis. But the constitutional mandate, as has always, and that has always been the issue when people talk about why the mandate needs to be changed, because if we were to look at what the mandate is in terms of the Constitution, Section 224, it instructs the Reserve Bank to protect the value of the currency in the interest of balanced and sustainable growth. I think this is broad enough to incorporate employment creation. I mean, there is no balanced and sustainable growth unless those factors are taken. It also reflects the understanding that protecting the value of the currency is critical, the critical foundation of attaining this lasting growth. As Kenneth pointed out, how it is important that you protect this value, because if you do not want a situation like, you know, north of Bay Bridge, where we had a currency that actually just lost its value to the extent that it actually no longer trades at all. But again, we've been down the road where the central bank actually had what we used to call the net open forward position, where we actually had to put in a lot of energy, effort, and resources in order to bring the country back from that debt situation, because we were sitting at in excess of 21 billion rands in the red because of a central bank that was actually doing what we are now calling for. And I think we should be careful that we do not end up in a similar situation. We've been down the road, and it is important that the central bank, as the lender of last resort, does what Kenneth was talking about earlier. When the economy is in crisis, to step in, but step in and make sure that that stepping in is limited in a manner that continues to preserve its intended role, and looking after money supply in the manner that it does.
All right. Kenneth, do you want to add something to that?
I think it's more or less covered. Just to say, you know, that that credibility is important, because we have an inequality crisis in South Africa. We have an unemployment crisis in South Africa. We have a growth crisis in South Africa. I've described the ship as sinking, I'm afraid, at the moment. We need to pull it back up somehow. But we can have other crises as well if we make mistakes now. We're already in a fiscal crisis, I would say. You know, maybe the minister's trying to say we're not, but we're entering a fiscal crisis where you have a default possibility. You can't really do what you want with the fiscal policy. And we must be careful of a financial crisis, a banking crisis. These are economic maladies that we don't want to get into. So we need to do the right thing, as they say, do the right thing. You know, if you do the wrong thing, you have another crisis and a compounding series of crises.
Right, thank you, Kenneth. Maybe I'll just stick with you. You've given us a bit of economic history in your presentation. Someone asked, is there an international example of a state like South Africa turning the economic problems around for the better? What did this involve from a political and institutional perspective, or are we too unique of a state? Are our problems too unique?
That's a really good question. Thanks for that question. And one always says it's a good question if you don't know the answer to it. But while you're saying that, you think of an answer. So I would say that South Africa is very, very unique. You know, we used to call it a colony of a special type. Unlike, say, a colony like Nigeria and those places where the settlers didn't live in the colony, but they just extracted, and sometimes they governed from boats, to be honest. They didn't come onto the land, and they just extracted from the boats. Our colony was different in that the settlers came here and they stayed, and they became part of the landscape. And very importantly, because of that, one of the consequences of that real intermeshing of the metropole and the colony was that we had a much more diversified industrial base than many other African countries. So you had a situation where that intermeshing of the colonizers staying on the land caused a situation where there was industrialization. The mines they mined for what they mined for, but they also developed industries around them. Service industries, universities were built, schools were built, and this country over hundreds of years was built up. So it is fairly unique in that history. I'm loath to say it's totally unique, but there are some elements that are uniquely South African, which give us our weaknesses of inequality and racism, but that also give us the potential, you know, to do things differently to other countries. But we can't reinvent the wheel. I mean, I talk about, I keep going back to the East Asian countries, China, Korea, those countries. They've proven that you can, you know, Korea, as you know, was probably cheaper, it was poorer than Ghana in 1960, the GDP per capita. And those countries have shown that through correct industrial policy, through good state-led policy, you can grow in a sustained way. And if you can grow in an inclusive way over 10 to 20 years, when we're having this webinar and you, Odile, are very old, and some of us are not even here, we can say, well, look at this growth we've had. Look how it's transformed things. We now have an energy that's driven by solar and wind. We have a hydrogen economy. We're selling green steel. We've got full employment. We've got free education. We've got a basic income grant. We've got all these good things because this economy was able to transform itself and to grow. So that must be our vision. But we can't, there's no shortcut. You know, we have to go through it over sustained growth over decades. And countries have done it.
Great. Nhlanhla, maybe I'll ask you to add on to Kenneth there. So he speaks about a vision, you know, for 10 or 20 years. But we know that our political parties, or rather not our political parties, our government, as we vote, changes every 5 years. How do we create a sustainable vision for the next 10 to 20 years, given that our problems require long-term solutions?
Look, at the end of the day, what's important is to have a long-term view as, for instance, as government of the day. We're not, government of the day is not governing for today, but we're looking at the future generations. It is for that reason that whatever it is that we do, be it our budgeting, be it our planning, be it our investment in infrastructure, it cannot be for this generation. It should be stretching beyond us. That is why investing in building the skills that the economy requires today, that it'll require tomorrow, is critical. Investing in such infrastructure, as we were saying about, on connectivity, about investing in our energy space, looking into the future and not just focusing on what we need today, becomes critical. And it is unfortunate that at times our politics blinds that side of the story, that we should actually be focusing on the future generations and not on ourselves, because when we, our political, bickering is the one that actually holds us back in realizing the future investment in both the skills and in the economy, and also just social investment in a manner that begins to preserve what we have for the future. So, our education system needs to begin to look at that, all our systems, and we are talking about investing in our health system in order to improve on the HDIs as well, because unless that part, the quality of life improves, we are actually looking at a nation that is going to be continuously drawing money to pump into the social services rather than in investing, and as it invests, that investment side of it in the productive capacity of the state begins to take care of the social side. Because at the end of the day, those two are not exclusively, they're not exclusive to each other. They're actually quite connected, so that at the end of the day, you need a flourishing economy. He makes an example of a Chinese economy that actually was poorer than Ghana back then. And today, that same economy has actually turned things around, precisely because there was a realization that the social side of the economy can only be taken care by a huge investment on the commercial side of it.
All right. Lucy, did you want to comment on that, or did you have a follow-up on Kenneth's comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, I think fundamentally, especially when we use, examples from the East Asian tigers or the East Asian economies that were successful, I think it is critical in the South African context that we return to the question of what is the role of the state? What is the role of business? What is the role of citizens? And how do the accountability mechanisms, function? Because I think, we think we're debating policy. But when you listen carefully to people, they tell you what they think the role of the state is in their comments, or in their comments about what business should be doing. And there are things that become contradictory, because sometimes there's this notion that like the role of the state should be minimal, people should have jobs, so that the state, can, doesn't have to have so much debt and so forth. But then there are things that then we say that contradict these notions of what state should be doing, what business should be doing, and so forth. And I think fundamentally we have to go back to this question. And I also want to the question of the role of the state, because people say it's a theoretical conversation. They'll say, we can't go back to theory. But I actually think this is where theory matters. Theory matters because theory informs our policy. And if our ideas about what the role of state are different, if our thinking around what business should be doing is different, we'll never agree on what the role of the state should be. In my perception of the state, the role of the state should be to regulate business. And that includes forcing business to give living wages. I don't think it's acceptable that in South Africa that even the people who are employed, are working poor, that they don't have living wages. I think it's the role of business to create and generate and invest and so forth, and the state to make as enabling of a framework. But then I think fundamentally it is important that state regulates business. And I think the last thing I want to add here is that, and especially excessive wealth, sorry, I have to add that one. State has to regulate excessive wealth. We've just had a boom, a commodities boom. Guess what? The people who are mining our minerals in South Africa are the ones who are walking away happily with a boom in profits. And I think it's important that we have a resource rent tax. I'm willing to put it out there that we need to have a resource rent tax, particularly when there's commodity booms. And lastly, I think I want to say that when I spoke about human rights mattering now, and that we can't, save them for tomorrow, it's not an argument to say that the future doesn't matter. The future matters, right? But it's to say that we have to create that environment now, right? It starts now. When you say we're planning, we're going to get to the future. At what point do we get to the future? We are planning for the future continuously. I mean, being born, I guess, and I guess my whole life, South Africa's been planning for the future. And I've grown and I'm an adult now, and this future is not necessarily brighter or as bright as they thought it would be in 1994. And I think it is important that we think about the future as urgent. And that's what I'm really saying. The future is now, right? It begins now. Human rights need to be met now. And in fact, what we need to do is we begin setting those principles. Our principles should be set. Our principles should be that we will not leave the vulnerable and exacerbate their situations now, so that the principle is simple. We will protect the vulnerable. And whether it's now, whether it's in the future, it doesn't matter, because that principle must be standard throughout the test of time. So that's what I meant by why these things are important today. It's more about the principles of what we need to implement today to make sure that we begin, yes, we'll move there eventually, but to say those things are urgent now. And actually part of the problem is the lack of urgency, of today. Thank you.
Thanks, Busi. Okay, so we're almost out of time for our last 5 minutes. I'll ask all our panelists to give one last comment, and this would be in the spirit of thinking long-term, but also recognizing that we need to start planning now for our long-term, or taking action rather now for the long-term. Leboheng, I'll start with you. What is one thing, if you were to give the minister, the finance minister, advice that he can implement today to make sure that, you know, next year we are in a better position when he gives his updated speech?
Thanks, Odile. So I think a lot of conversation has been revolving around growing the economy and all that going forward, you know, for the sake of the future and abundance. But I think the one thing that we always need to keep back of our mind is to make sure that we are always efficient in the way that we deal with you know, government finances going forward, because it wouldn't help us to you know, create restructure the economy in order to make sure that there's enough revenue for the state to spend, et cetera, without fixing the efficiencies around fiscal prudence, around making sure that SARS in the end is going to collect all those taxes that are supposed to be due from the revenue that will be created from that abundance. So one message to the minister: focus on SARS, fix SARS, make sure that SARS can go after things like basin erosion and profit shifting, transfer pricing abuse, illicit trade from a customs and excise perspective, and then we'll be good to go.
Right, so fix SARS. Kenneth?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it's been really good to listen to Busi and Leboheng and Professor Nene and others. So thanks very much for this opportunity. I've learned quite a lot from listening to everybody. I think for me, I mean, the budget will be, there'll be the medium-term budget at the end of this year. The budget will be announced next year again in February. And I really hope to see an emphasis on those growth reforms. And I hope to see an improvement in our projected growth rates. That's what I'm going to be looking at in those budgets. You know, is that rhetorical commitment to Vulindlela and such reforms starting to have an impact on the actual growth rates? The quality of that growth is obviously key. It must be inclusive. It can't be reinforcing inequality. We don't want that. But for me, it's a precondition. You know, we're not going to reduce inequality. We're not going to create jobs until we get those, that key number must rise. It must rise. It must rise and it must stay at a higher level. It can't be, we must do things that mean it's sustained to do that. So that would be my, when I'm thinking about the next 2 budgets or so, that's what I'm going to be looking at. And that's what we must all be working at if we get opportunities to try and get those reforms, you know, to be implemented. I think we're in a time of reform, of recreation, and we must do it. The debate we're having about the future, I agree that now is very important. We mustn't do anything now that makes it worse in the future. We can see that the previous decisions have left us in this situation where we are so much in debt now. We must not let that happen again. Thank you very much for the opportunity, Odile.
Okay, pushing up that growth rate. Busi, a quick one from you.
Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you all the panel for the interesting discussions. You know, it's always great to be on platforms where we all actually unpack our differences and similarities, actually very important. I think, yeah, my last message is really to say, how do we meet people's material needs, but also capture their imaginations? And how do we think differently about where we want to be? Where are we trying to go? What are we trying to solve? How are we going to solve it without reproducing racialized capitalism and patriarchy? How do we dismantle these systems of oppression and the budget being a critical playing a critical role in it? So how do we start thinking about our budget differently and how it makes sure that we are not reproducing these systematic oppressions that people are facing on the day-to-day, and speak to people's needs? I think this budget is speaking to, I don't know, something else, South Africa, different South Africa, I don't know who it's even speaking to, but really, how do we make sure that people feel the budget on the ground where they are? How does the budget meet people on the ground?
All right. Kantla, a quick one from you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Odile, and thanks to the panelists and everybody else that asked questions and contributed. It indeed has been quite an enriching experience, and I truly enjoyed it. But my parting shot would be, this opportunity comes once a year, where we actually have to unpack what is in this expression of government policy through its budget, allocation of resources. But I think in discussing this, we should also bear in mind that, as I said, we should also think about where resources come from, in order, because I think the focus tends to be more on the allocation of resources. We a number of times behave like National Treasury is a breadwinner who walks into a family and has been retrenched, or he has taken a salary cut and he wants to tell his family that from now on we're going to spend less, but we would still want to try and to maintain our standard of living, which in my view is quite a difficult task. But we should not treat National Treasury as that breadwinner, because all of us should then begin to say, wow, now that the breadwinner here has lost his job or has taken a salary cut, perhaps we all have to do our bit in order to augment whatever comes into the household, in order for us all, to have a better life. So I would imagine that I think it is important that when the budget is tabled, our discussions do not only center around the allocation of these resources, but also should be focusing, as Olebachang and Michael were actually saying, on strengthening the revenue collection side, but at the same time, the efficiency and the quality of spending those resources once we have them.
Great, perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you, panelists. We are out of time. So the School of Business School, we appreciate the opportunity to share our thoughts, and to the attendees for your engagement. We appreciate it. And hopefully next year, this time, we'll have a better story to tell. All right.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.